The range time is expired, right? No?
I can have another 10 minutes if you're willing to give it.
The case ain't getting any better.
I go up on the Prime Minister to deliver your first speech here.
At least I got average.
So that's the standpoint of how our speaks are going to be.
Yes, I guess.
Standard.
All right, we want to be very clear about the products that we're talking about in this debate. Yes, here. We're talking about tractors for farming, which occur in the developing nations, where in the developed nations you have newer products that are available, but these developing nations need these tractors and don't necessarily have enough money to buy the newer ones. We're talking about generators, which the electricity of that whole nation is dependent upon. However, the corporations have created the newer one, but have not yet but these nations cannot simply change. We're talking about syringes that a nation's medical system has modified its infrastructure completely to be compatible with, and yet these corporations go about changing it. We think that these are things which cannot simply be changed like in a flash. It cannot be simply changed early, and we need these are things also that are integrated into the deep core roots of these nations. Therefore, if these things stop working, or if they cannot repair these things, then we believe that the whole nation, who are supported by these generators, by these syringes, are going to fall down massively. And those are the products we would like to talk about. Firstly, I'm going to tell you about why the harms of discontinuation are negative externalities brought about by these corporations, and why the corporations have a duty to negate them as much as possible. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the massive unequal bargaining power which by allowing this abandonment of support gives to these corporations, and those are going to be the main 2 points in the speech. So firstly, the harms of discontinuation. We believe that this is a negative externality brought about by these corporations and their decision to arbitrarily stop supporting their old products. We think that the buyers, these nations, committed into buying these products, which are into the deep core roots of these nations, through marketing done by these corporations, or maybe through lobbying done by these corporations. And at that point in time, these states decided to pin their whole economic viability on the assumption that this product that they are going to be buying will be in use for a long time. Things like 50 years, 60 years, the normal lifespan of a generator, which would go about charging a whole nation. But in order for that lifespan to be maximized, in order for it to be used for that full extent of that lifespan, it requires support, it requires maintenance, it requires repairing. However, and then they buy it with the assumption that that repairing and that support is always going to be there for that lifespan of that product. However, these corporations, by deciding to simply quit that support, we believe, is creating a situation where they're not fully obliging with their contractual duties. We also need to understand that the buyers, they buy it with the expectation of the future output of these products, to use it for the operable lifetime of these products, and when they are cut short because they stop repairing, when they are cut short because these corporations simply and arbitrarily believe that it's not beneficial for that corporation itself to go about supporting that old product, then it is pushing that negative externality of that action onto that corporation, onto that nation, and onto the people inside these nations. We believe that the corporations themselves have their duty to negate the harms as much as possible, because we believe that there is this existence of an implicit contract between the buyer, which is the nation, and the seller, the corporation. We believe that firstly, the buyer, when they are buying these products, the nation when they're buying the syringes, which they create the whole medical system around, or when they're buying the generators, which create the electricity for the whole nation, we think that they buy it with the assumption, and the reasonable assumption, that they can use that technology freely until the lifespan actually goes out of life. However, the corporations, firstly, we need to understand, have gained massive amounts of profits through the sales of these products, and we think that it's firstly only fair to balance out the cost of the decision to discontinue with the harm brought about to the nations. But more importantly, we need to understand the asymmetry of information which exists between the corporation and the nation in itself. It's not foreseeable for a government to see that there may be a better generator coming up in 5 years' time, that there may be a better medical equipment coming up in 3 years' time, and therefore we don't necessarily think that the government. We don't necessarily think that the government goes about buying these things with that in mind. They believe that this is the best product which is going to last the lifespan, and that it's still going to get that support from the corporation. However, the corporation is in a complete different stance where they can have that information, where they can have that knowledge that a new thing might come out. Therefore, with that asymmetry of information existing even at the point of purchase for these nations, we think it's only fair that the corporations have a duty to negate those negative externalities that occur because of the corporation's decision to continue buying, or continue supporting these old products and shift to a newer product. The second point I'm going to talk about is about the massive unequal bargaining power, but yes, Val.
It's just absolute bollocks that companies do not, or that countries do not have the information they need. Warranties from the start are agreed upon by corporations, and people who are buying it know it. That's why they didn't go to another brand and decided to contract this company.
They decided to contract with a certain corporation because they believe that the product from that corporation is going to be more beneficial for that nation in comparison to the other nations. The information asymmetry we're talking about is the development in the future of the other products that may come out in the future, the development which may occur. In a context where the corporation has that ability to foresee the technological developments in that particular field which they're experts in, we think that it's ridiculous to compare that with the same amount of knowledge which the governments are going to have, with the knowledge that the governments are going to have, which isn't in the same level of these corporations. So secondly, about the massive unequal bargaining power which this allows. We believe that these corporations can leverage to an enormous extent over these nations because firstly, these nations have made a huge investment into these products and they can't simply shift up from it, they can't simply opt out from it easily, and secondly, because in order for these nations to continue the usage of these products, they need the support from these corporations, and the corporations are the only actor to be able to guarantee them and give them the support. We think that we're talking about stuff that are vital to the economy of these nations, and therefore they are in a position where they have to pay anything for it. We're talking about things like healthcare. Healthcare is similar to this, wherein if there's a choice between death or treatment, you're put in a position where you have to pay as much as you need because the other option isn't an option really for you. That's why in the case of healthcare, the government organizes collective healthcare bargaining and you have universal healthcare, right? We think that it's not morally just to exploit the fact that you no longer have a choice after you buy these products. After you buy it, you no longer have the capability to change simply or to opt out easily. But we think that the corporations exploiting the people's lack of capability is something wrong. We also need to understand that the people who are suffering are not the ones who decided to buy the product. It's the people on the ground who are suffering, and for those people we think that it's wrong on a moral basis to take away their choice and keep them in a position where they continuously get harmed.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd like to call on the leader of the opposition. Hume.
Mr. Speaker, bear in mind this motion calls for a value judgment debate on what action the corporate should take when it comes to their value judgment on where the consumer rights are going to end and corporate rights are going to begin. Bear in mind that Tsai government never explained why in the eyes of the corporate that should be the calculus that they should be taking and why that's a more preferable choice that these corporates are making. Before I move on into my own case, I have a couple of responses to Prime Minister. Number one, we think we need to draw a very clear distinction regarding this debate, because on side opposition, we're not banning the usage of these services or products that are meant to, for example, better these products or services that these individuals are using, which means the individuals or consumers can still have access to betterment of those services. It just means that it won't get the support of the corporates, which means it'll be just a little more costly. In fact, we think it's unfair that the Tsai government is assuming that that the corporates these companies are the only ones that can necessarily fix or better the quality of the services. Because if you look at the status quo, most of the betterment of the services or upgrade of the services are in fact done by third parties, i.e. other industries that are related to the industries that are actually producing or directly giving those services, which means it's not really a barring of the consumer rights. But the second thing I need to address is this. We want to ask this question of why exactly, if the entire nation is so dependent on this specific service or good, whether that be generator, whether that be tractor, why would the corporates have any incentive to stop producing that service or stop producing that good? Because economics 101 tells you that supply and demand are going to naturally meet each other, which means if the people are so dependent on tractors or generators, and if everyone uses them every day, then the corporates are going to have a natural incentive to keep producing them. If the corporates stop producing them, that must mean that the individuals are not using them to the extent that it's simply not profitable enough for these corporates. But the second thing I need to talk about under this is this. We think that to a certain extent there already exists a natural check and balance, which means already, because the consumers are at the pinnacle of the concern of these corporates, already there exists a natural incentive for these corporates to fulfill the best interests and to cater to the needs of their consumers. They obviously don't want to piss off their consumers by, for example, producing new products or new generators every year or every couple of months because they don't want to get a bad name and piss those consumers off. The idea Yuki was trying to get at was this argument on information as asymmetry. A couple of ideas under this. Number one, Valeri pointed out to me in her point of information that consumers already make a certain calculus when they also view the warranties that the corporates give them, and that already is an informed choice that they're making. If the argument the government is trying to get at is that the information is lacking, we're completely happy to provide more information that the consumers can make a better choice. But secondly, it's really ridiculous to assume that because these individuals are not going to know what's going to happen in the future, companies' rights are automatically going to be curbed. Because following your logic, it means because at the time that iPhone 4 is produced, we don't know if iPhone 5 and iPhone 6 is going to be produced either. That means they're telling Apple to stop producing any more iPhones because the consumers simply don't have any information on what's going to happen in the future. We think that's just simply ridiculous. Stance coming from side opposition is very simple. We think that we're not telling these corporates that they should always be making this choice of abandoning any more upgrades or any more provision of services or any more subsidies regarding this. But we think the stance is when the corporates feel like it's necessary and it's in their interest in making their own value judgment on calculuses, then we should leave it to whatever these corporates decide to do. Before I move on into my actual substantive, yes.
Yes. Does a farmer laboring in the fields read the warranty on the electrical generator that gives him his livelihood?
We think when the corporates are providing warranties or information, the assumption is that individuals are going to be reading them. If the very idea is that people are not able to read it, then we're completely happy with helping them read it better. Let's directly move on to my argumentation. The first part of my argumentation is going to be answering the question of why should the companies be necessarily prioritizing what should be their priority in the relationship between the corporates and consumers. We think the only time that we override any corporate rights or even the corporates concede to the overriding of their own rights is when there is active harm to the consumers or when they're actively doing wrong to the consumers. Because we think the relationship between a consumer and a corporate is a lot like a contract. So only when the corporate is breaching that contract, that's the only time when the corporate overrides its own right and gives priority to the consumer rights. For example, in the misinformation of contract, or for example, when the corporate is not keeping up with the warrants that it promised to keep up. So we think in the case of discontinuing support or subsidy for a certain product, we think consumers completely have the information that the production of service or good isn't going to be eternal, i.e. in 2080, it's not going to continue to become produced, right? We think they knowingly enter this contract, and we already told you if the expectation of this contract of knowing this information is low, then we're happy to inform them more. But the second thing I want to talk about is why when there is simply no breach of contract, it's simply unfair to curb the corporate rights. Because we think it's simply unrealistic and unfair to expect corporates to burden the cost of uncontrollable and uncertain behaviors or even changes in technology that's going to happen and even patterns of consumers, for example. Because number one, on a very principle level, we think the only right or only duty that the corporates have is to maximize profit. Corporates simply don't exist for moral causes, the government does. And the government that's an argument for the government giving subsidies to these individuals for continuing those support for these technologies, for example. But secondly, we think it's extremely costly to maintain the very product or services on the hand of these consumers, especially in an era where technology changes very rapidly and upgrades are necessary so often. So we think it's simply unfair to give this burden to these consumers. But the third thing I want to talk about is this. We think corporates should have this very autonomy over the allocation of their spending, simply because the corporates also make a risk and benefit analysis or calculus of what they're going to invest in. Meaning, if they invest in a certain thing, they need to get profit for it, they need to reap certain benefits. We think the reason why they should have this allocation and autonomy over the spending is because they're the ones that are going to be most and directly affected by whatever choices or investment or spending that they choose to make. But the last thing I want to talk about is how even in the defense of the hands of the consumers, by following government's model, you're going to be harming even the consumers, right? Because if you're interfering with the very process of autonomy over spending or allocation of funding, then corporates are obviously going to look for a way to fill up and compensate for the losses that they have made. Which means the only people that they end up being harmed by this, when you court the corporate autonomy or profit, when that's becoming strained, is the consumers, for example, by higher prices or lower service qualities that the consumers have to bear at the end of the day. So when you follow this logic, we simply don't think there's any kind of principles, reason to curb these corporate rights. We think you're only harming consumer rights. We're very happy to oppose.
얘가 opportunity to open the premise here.
Well, that was disappointingly esoteric. See, what they do not understand on that side of the house is that the people who use these products, who are dependent on these products, are not the ones buying them. This is not a relationship between provider and consumer. Governments are involved, and these governments are making decisions on behalf of those on the ground. And those on the ground do not consent to these sorts of agreements, yet they are dependent on them, yet they are dependent on these products existing into the future. So all this analysis about, consumers and corporations and make a contract and all this stuff just isn't applicable to this debate, because the people that are dependent on these products are not the ones making the choice to buy them in the first place. A little bit of rebuttal. They tried to tell us that there are lots of third parties that can repair these things. Blatantly false. For example, in the example of generators, TEPCO is the only one that can repair TEPCO generators, which is why the Japanese government is dependent on TEPCO in order to fix the nuclear leak. Second of all, they told us, well, why would a corporation stop producing something if people need it? Very simple, relative profitability. Why would a corporation stop producing old-style phones in favor of smartphones, right? Even though there are some people who would still prefer to use that old-style phone. Well, it's because they can devote those slack resources to a higher profitability margin in the smartphone market. So if we're talking about developing countries, there's huge incentives for corporations to discontinue those kinds of products that do not need as high profit margins as newer, fancier products that they can sell to developed countries. Then they tried to tell us that if there is no breach of contract, it is not reasonable to make these companies pay for externalities. Blatantly false and no good analysis. First of all, we say that when there is asymmetry of information, you are allowed to curb corporate rights. I'll give the example in buying a faulty product. When you buy a faulty product, the reason why you are allowed, in fact, it is a legal requirement that you're allowed to return that product because there is asymmetry of information between the corporation and the consumer. The corporation can know the quality of that product, but the consumer cannot. And at the point of purchase, they do not have the same level of information as the corporation does. Therefore, you are allowed to infringe on the corporation's right to profit because of that inherent asymmetry of information between corporation and consumer. But furthermore, we say there is an implicit contract in these sorts of purchases that these things will be able to use into the future. As Yuki said, governments that don't have giant R&D departments full of engineers cannot accurately predict whether or not new innovations will be available in 3, 4, or 5 years. But companies can, because they might be in the active act of developing them. So we can have corporations selling you shit that they know is going to be obsolete, so they can extort you in the future, and you have no ability to defend yourself against this sort of exploitation because you do not have the capability to understand whether or not these things will be useful in the future. So what am I going to bring you today? One, I'm going to bring 4 or 5 extensions. One about political control. One is about the possibility of technological innovation raising living standards. Then one about consent, and one about future profitability. How this might actually be better for corporations in the future. Because contrary to what they might say, corporations do not have perfect foreseeability. They don't know what's going to happen in the future. They might make mistakes. mistakes, and maybe we can actually help them out by preventing them from making stupid mistakes when they think it's profitable. Put it in control. What happens when your economy is completely dependent on a foreign corporation, say, a multinational? What happens is you can't pass policies to protect your populace because, say, like, if the corporation doesn't like this, they like pull support and your whole economy craters. Like, so what are you going to do? Like, let's say that corporation is exploiting your people's workers, but they say, well, if you pass workers' right laws, guess what? We're not going to provide support for your reactors anymore, right? In that case, you do not have the capability, you do not have the sovereignty to protect your own people against exploitation of these corporations. Furthermore, we say that it prevents you from like taking positive actions for your own industries, right? The corporation might say, well, if you pass laws to protect nascent industries, guess what? No more support for these vital services, right? And so you can't take those acts either. And so what we're saying in the House is when we say they should never discontinue, we also mean they should not use the threat of discontinuation as a bargaining chip, right? They should not ever be able to say, we will discontinue this unless you give us benefits, right? This is exploitation and that is wrong. Next point, right? We say that this takes away the possibility of using those better products in the future. Because guess what? If you don't have money, you can't buy shit. If your economy doesn't work, you can't buy better products. That means you're stuck in a technological ghetto where you're using this technology that you don't even know how to service or how it works. Because the corporation has arbitrarily decided that it is not going to provide you with the things that you need to have buying power, the things that you need to develop your economy. So these corporations can exploit these countries and stick them in a technological developmental ghetto for years and years and years and years, and you have no capability to improve the living standards of your people. Third, we say consent. The people who need these products are not the ones who buy them. And this is where all the analysis from the first speaker breaks down, okay? We have governments buying products on behalf of the people who need it, right? So these people do not get to read the warranty. These people do not get to analyze the products. Farmers do not get to get different pitches from the different tech companies, right? Instead, we have people in governments making these decisions for them. So that means that you, the person on the ground, the farmer who needs this stuff in order to feed yourself, are at the whim of foreign corporations, at the whim of a contract that you never consented to. And when we say that these people did not consent to the contract, they should not have to bear the harms that she says are implicit in any given contract. It is unjust, it is wrong. Furthermore, we say that this may actually destroy future profitability in these countries without taking POI anyone.
Yeah, so are you saying that when a farmer in Africa, his tractor breaks down, he phones the tractor company in Germany? Is that how you think it works?
No, that's how you think it works. That's what you said. That's what you said. That's what you said it works. What we say is that the government is purchasing these things on your behalf and providing them to you. You have no ability to agree to that contract, right? The government has agreed to it on your behalf. So the corporation should not be able to inflict externalities upon you that emerge from that contract because you did not consent to it in the first place. You're the ones who think that the farmers are like shopping around for these like reactors and weighing up and reading the contract, right? Ooh, fine print. Like the farmer doesn't even fucking know how to read, okay? So furthermore, what we say is this may actually hurt future profitability. Why? Corporations cannot perfectly predict future economic situations. What this means is that these companies may shoot themselves in the foot by screwing over a country that's going to be rich in the future. I'll give you an example. No one could predict that in 1960, South Korea would be one of the richest countries in the world. In fact, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. So if we have companies who pull out, who screw the Korean people, who fuck them over by taking away their vital services, these companies will not be able to get profits from Korea in the future because the Korean people are going to remember that this company screwed us over. They didn't care about us. They violated our rights and they exploited us. So we're not going to buy their products. That means there are many, many companies that might shoot themselves in the foot by thinking that it's profitable, but actually like deleteriously hurting their interests in the long run. What have you shown me today? We showed me that their analysis is unrealistic, first of all, because the people who the externality violates are not the ones who agreed to the contract in the first place, that this gives political control to multinationals, violates sovereignty, that this takes away the profitability of future like technological and economic development, that it violates consent, and that it might hurt future profitability. And for all those reasons, we are very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank to Deputy Prime Minister. I have to go upon the Deputy Leader here.
As the only person in this room who actually comes from the developing world, I may know a thing or two about poverty. And what I can tell you is that the previous speech is absolutely offensive. I want to deal with two things first.
First, let's talk about asymmetry of information, which I have 3 responses to. Because his claim is that farmers didn't consent to anything that the governments did. They don't even know how to read, right? The first is, if they don't, then your POI to my teammate is absolutely stupid. Because farmers didn't need to be the ones to read the terms of conditions because it was governments dealing it out for them. So the second rebuttal to this is simple. Being poor and being from a poor country does not mean we don't have elections. We still have a representative government, and the reason why the government can negotiate with these corporations, sign terms and conditions, read it on our behalf, is because we gave them the mandate to do so and give them the ability called sovereignty to negotiate with those corporations. Their signatures are just as valid as valid if you pass on a single piece of paper to every single person in the Philippines. It's going to be the exact same thing. It's called it's called a representative democracy, and it doesn't just work in the first world, it works in the third world too. But third, assuming that governments are botched, for example, and that governments don't really have a perfect decision-making skill, and apparently farmers really didn't want the tractors provided to them by the government, that's an argument for better decision-making processes in the third world. That's an argument for helping us out with our political system. Not an argument for companies having to fill in for the inefficiencies, failures, and stupidities of inefficient governments in the third world. That doesn't prove anything. Here's the second response. They then want to talk to us about taking care of corporations. And I think it's absolutely hypocritical to try and run that argument. Nice try. Because they said corporations don't have perfect foresight, right? Yeah, and you do? Because look, we already told you from the start, and this is what Youngcho said and you ignored, that capitalism self-corrects. If corporations can foresee in the future that then providing this type of service that has been discontinued will become profitable again, what's stopping them from restoring that particular service? It's not as if they still don't have the same blueprint that will allow them to actually train engineers again, to produce those parts again, and to buy the exact same supplies, right? But if it continues to be non-profitable, then that's the only time they'll discontinue it. The question is, when they have made the value, this value judgment, that at that point in time it's still not profitable, why are you forcing them to retract on that site, not even foresight, because it's happening at the present, and forcing them to actually still produce it at the consumer's expense? Because one response that they also didn't make is how it's going to ultimately still be passed on to the exact same people, maybe not even nations, but the other consumers, for example, of Toshiba or of Samsung, who are ordinary individuals and will now have to bear the cost for those third world nations. What's their responsibility to the Filipinos, ladies and gentlemen? Absolutely no link. Here's the case that I'm going to run for you today. I will talk to you about how, in terms of access, third world nations are significantly more privileged than corporations are, and we think this is going to provide a very nifty escape clause for third world governments to be lazy at doing their jobs. Before I proceed, sure.
Given that most developing countries don't have particularly effective democracy, isn't it a fundamental violation of contract to sell it to, say, a dictator who doesn't make decisions on behalf of his people?
It is. So I guess in the previous debate with the ICC, you can start working on those dictators, but I don't understand why Samsung needs to bear that cost, right? Here's the argument. In terms of access, there are 4 levels of analysis. First, I want to ask, why is it that it is a primary corporation's concern? Why is it that it's supposed to be a corporation's concern that third world governments get to access their products? It's not. Inaccessible products, ladies and gentlemen, is not the corporation's fault. If their products are too expensive, that's not because their products are too expensive, that's because a poor country is poor, right? So when a poor country is unable to buy those products, but first world governments are, that probably means that it was a third world government's failing to have developed their economy to be able to access these goods. There's no liability to the company. On the second level of analysis, in the absence of access to this particular corporation, for example, say you've already bought their trains in the past and you need to repair it now, is it really the end-all be-all now? It's not, because when the Philippines cannot access Japanese trains because they're good quality and they're too expensive, you know where we go? To China, because that's how the economy works, right? There are niche markets where if certain types of individuals or economies and countries cannot buy them, other types of producers fill in the gap. It's called a niche market, and people want to capture that as well. Because albeit the profit is small, the profit still exists. And if Japanese corporations don't want to stoop down to that level, trust me, the Chinese corporations will. And if you look at it, even if those products break down, are Japanese people the only people who know how to repair things in the world? No. Earth to you guys, Indian people actually produce more engineers than the Japanese population, right? And it's exactly why when when we cannot afford Japanese engineers to repair our product, we then just circumvent that by paying for the fine and pay for cheaper engineers if the cost is less. But if the cost is more, then we go back to the Japanese corporations. The point is, you have a multitude of options, and the third world nations aren't as oppressed as they portray us to be. But here's third level of analysis. Third world nations are even more privileged than corporations. Because in times where we cannot access goods, we have the IMF backing us up, the World Bank to provide us loans, ADB to give us technological grants, and individual countries who want to build partnerships and build trust, ladies and gentlemen, to give us technological transfers and to fund specific types of goods.